Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here this morning to host a webinar for the LPEA on something that's close to our hearts here. And we've got some of the early investors in Deeptech across Europe. We're waiting for another panelist, but we will get started. So I've got, as I mentioned, two VCs here who have been focusing on early stage deep tech investing, primarily across Europe. We've got Dan coming from Cycle Group, based out of Luxembourg, and Dan will speak in more and introduce his firm and speak in more details as to what he's doing. We've got Tommy, who runs Vsquared out of Munich, and also doing a slightly different flavor of deep tech investing. And Stephen, who just joined us, who's at Lakestar, looking after their deep tech investments and strategy. So with no further ado, I will turn the mic to the participants so they can introduce themselves and their firms, and I'm sure that will get the conversation going. Dan, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Dan. I'm a founding partner of Cycle Group. We're a deep tech fund based in Luxembourg. I'm now in a second fund generation, just launching. We invested in mainly hardware technologies in semiconductors and energy-related efficiency. We invested in transformer technologies, semiconductor manufacturing, fuel cells. We'll go into details later. So we look for hardware companies in Europe that are really changing the potential of some of these technologies. Yeah, good. I'll hand over to Tommy.
Yeah, hi all. I'm Tommy from Vsquared. Vsquared is a deep tech fund out of Munich. We started off in 2016, where deep tech was not really a thing. That changed over the last couple of years. We right now have around 5 funds active, different topics here and there in different stages a bit, but all in all, it's around 400 million AUM. Been one of the early investors in companies like ISA Aerospace, IQM Quantum, Micropsy, Scilab, Constellar. So the idea is to invest right broad into deep tech topics around energy transition, space, new computing and sensing, some tech bio stuff, and an opportunistic pocket on let's see what's out there that really is changing or helping to solve one of the most pressing problems through tech at scale pretty fast. We do that at the early stages, but again, as said, do have some fund vehicles that can help also in Series B's and C's. Very, very much looking forward to the discussion.
Great, and I'm Steve. I lead the deep tech investment thesis here at Lakestar. Lakestar is a roughly 10-year-old VC based out of Berlin, London, and Zurich. We have a little over 2 billion in assets under management. Our latest funds, we have an early stage fund that invests in seed and Series A, and a growth stage fund that does Series B, C, and D. Our Lakestar in general is fairly generalist. We have 7 partners, 7 theses, including fintech, health tech, vertical SaaS, horizontal platforms, climate tech, games and media. And then, like I said, I lead the deep tech investment thesis. And within deep tech, we focus on fundamentally new science and engineering that are making their way into products and companies for the first time. So only things that are fundamentally new. And we look for technologies that are intercepting some of the world's biggest problems, preferably ones that are currently intractable. Climate change being a very prominent example these days. 5 areas of focus for us in the moment include space tech, future of compute, computational biology, novel AI, and novel energy. So I will leave it there. Very nice to meet everyone again this morning.
Thank you, gentlemen. You know, I think it's what's interesting here is that this is an emerging space. and it's been gaining in prominence over the last few years. That being said, everything is far from perfect, and deep tech is facing some significant issues, particularly in Europe. I've used the report that you co-authored with Walden Catalyst and Deal Room, Stephen, at Lakestar. There's some really interesting findings in that report. The first finding is that, yes, deep tech is gaining in prominence across the world, and particularly in Europe, leveraging really strong academia, industrial base. At the same time, some of the key issues and hurdles facing deep tech companies as they scale across Europe is the availability of capital and also talent to some extent. So we'd love to hear from you, how you see that market evolving since you got started, and what do you think are the key strengths and weaknesses in the European ecosystem?
Yeah, and I don't have the report in front of me at the moment, so I can't cite every statistic, but I encourage everyone to, if you just Google kind of Deal Room European State of Deep Tech, they host the report on their website because we use their data sets predominantly. But we co-authored that, like you said, with Walden Catalyst, and tried to just pull a data-driven case for deep tech in Europe there. I think to your question, when you look at the amount of published research and the number of university students that are focusing on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and yeah, a number of these kind of good leading indicators of, will there be supply side on the talent pool, and is there kind of sufficient training within the ecosystem to be competitive on a global scale around a lot of these new science and engineering disciplines, right? So deep tech precursors. I think Europe punches above its weight, right? 4 out of 12 of the top leading technical universities are here in Europe. Like, we are at par with the US and China. And in some areas where, we over-index, in some areas we under-index. But I think in general, on the talent side, we're actually in a fairly good position from a technical standpoint. I think that we still have a ways to go in terms of embedding a culture of entrepreneurialism and risk-taking into the educational system in various places within Europe. I think that's changing. I think as access to information becomes more and more democratized through the internet and online courses, we're seeing individuals start to teach themselves these things outside of kind of your standard institutions. So I think that's a positive sign. And I think the more examples of successful global scale businesses that emerge out of Europe, you just get more and more inspiration and more confidence that it can be done. And so I think we're kind of right at the beginning of that transition here within Europe in terms of, choosing, instead of going to a large automotive company, for example, to take a risk and start a company and use some new technology you've developed to kind of build your own, a very large business. So maybe I'll pause there. I know I answered part of the question, not the whole thing, but I want to give Dan and Tommy a chance to chime in as well if they have something they want to add.
Thank you, Stephen.
I mean,
Tommy, you first.
yeah. So, most of the most important parts have been said in terms of what's the opportunity within Europe. And if you just look on what's the heritage of the economic wealth across Europe, it's all been started by people who created something entirely new, where most others been saying, why do we need it? Or it's impossible. So having that playground and then looking into, that was our thesis back then, saying what's completely underfunded, what is Europe exceptionally strong at, and where are markets at your doorstep, so you don't have to go right away to Asia or to the US to become a really big company. If you all merge that together, you end up by deep tech or science-driven, engineering-driven companies. And leveraging on that capital at the early stages is necessary and was necessary, but we now have to figure out how we can build European champions. And regulatory is one part of it that we may be going to touch upon later on, but it is capital and the education, the right education of that talent, how it can play out if you you do not end up in an R&D facility at a larger corporation or one of these institutions, but if you do it yourself. So educating on what's necessary to become an entrepreneur or to gather a team that can pull it off, that's really crucial aside the capital side.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can add to this where let me sprinkle a little bit of disagreement in there, because I think that mixes up the thing a bit, and maybe it's more fun and gets most out of the session. So I think Europe had strong engineering capabilities always, and a lot of what we call deep tech nowadays, or what's sold under that hashtag has been around for a long time. Optical computing, optical laser systems, where the deep science has been developed mainly a lot of the stuff has been developed in Europe, but it hasn't been commercialized in Europe so strongly. If we look at the things that have been well commercialized in Europe, these were mainly large companies coming out of Philips, span out of Philips, ASML, optoelectronics. In a lot of the things have been driven by corporate venture, by corporate acquisitions in Europe, and not so much through venture capital. So it's another dynamic in the path. And now all of us are trying to accelerate this now. I love the deals you guys have been doing. A couple of your deals I really like a lot, Thomas and Stephen, and also Pierre. Didn't start my fund early enough to participate in some of these deals, but now we're in the same ecosystem. I think when it goes to graphical computing, when it comes to optical computing, when it comes to space, also electronics manufacturing, Europe has always been there, but not as loud and not as pumped with venture funding as other regions. It was more the corporate leading a coordinated effort of developing companies there, and German high-tech companies have been, or Mittelstand have been deploying semiconductor manufacturing technologies all over Asia for decades now. So I think the industry was there, but it hasn't been the target of venture capital for a long time. Not as the focus wasn't there; it was mainly on software. But now with you both emphasized the case for energy efficiency. That can't be solved with software, obviously, because it's physical things that have to change, consumption patterns that have to change, electronic components that have to change. So I'm really interested what you guys think about those. Maybe I can add 3 terms to this to emphasize what Cycle is looking for. We're looking for technology tipping points for technologies. Things that are known or predicted in scientific development, but are not there in technology readiness level yet. They are early enough that the corporate ventures and the corporates aren't funding them strongly yet. But we believe that they can happen, and I see in all 3 of your portfolios that you're also looking at this. So maybe I put three terms out there, and we play a little bit around with them. So we're looking at beyond the Carnot cycle. So as you know, combustion engines are limited. Gas turbines have a peak efficiency, which is around I think the world record is somewhere around 55%. Don't quote me on this, 53.5 or something like this. So the Carnot cycle physically limits some of the combustion processes that we have, but with fuel cells we can theoretically go beyond that. So fuel efficiency can outperform combustion. We're looking at shifting the Kaiser limit. So if you look at photovoltaic, if you look at solar cells, then at the moment we have a lot of research going on in triple junction cells, double junction cells that can absorb more infrared light. And there's more efficiency to gain there, but this has to be industrialized, and at the moment at the very beginning. And a lot of that research is led in European institutions. And then we're looking into wide bandgap computing. So we think that there's there's a revolution actually not beginning, but really accelerating at the moment in wide bandgap semiconductors for electronics, for power electronics especially, but that has implications in other areas too. So these are some of the 3 deep tech areas that we are looking at, and there are many more I can confuse us with, but yeah, maybe we start. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, before we go down the rabbit hole of, you know, who does what and who's really interested in what, I think you made an interesting point, Dan, around you know, deep tech financing in Europe up until relatively recently. I mean, as far as my experience, deep tech VC has been around for a very long time. It was called something different, obviously. It mainly revolved around semiconductors and other, you know, kind of exotic science-based endeavors, in the past, and then it kind of moved towards emerging sectors. You know, I think you alluded to energy tech, which was called, you know, kind of clean tech, started in 2005, ended up in a bubble and in a lot of tiers, you know, across the VC landscape, particularly in the US. So I think that's an interesting point. And, you know, we also have we're lucky to have Stephen, who happened to be working in a fund that's, number one, not a sector specialist like we all are on this call. And he's also a multi-stage fund addressing and investing in companies at various stages of growth. I think one of the hurdles in scaling deep tech innovation in Europe and deep tech ventures is really that financing gap. You know, I think you can find relative amounts of financing at the very early stages in the form of equity from early stage funds, but also grants and others, and non-recurring engineering work that you could get from, you know, potential customers and partners. But as you start scaling those companies, what we've observed, certainly, I think, you know, Tommy and me, we've seen quite a lot of our companies, you know, going through those hurdles and growing pains. Getting financing from the larger, later stage journalist funds, certainly in Europe, has been a challenge. So we'd love to get your perspectives on that, maybe starting with Stephen, because of his unique vantage point of being one of the very few deep tech specialists in a multi-stage European generalist fund.
Sure. And nice job guiding us back to the second half of your question originally. So the way we think about this, and there's a nice little visual of this in the deep tech report for folks who kind of want a visual aid for it. But deep tech companies tend to travel a path from research, say in a lab, to development. So like, let's say laboratory research, product development. Then there's this phase of application where you're figuring out where's product market fit. Can I solve a real problem with it? Then you scale it and then eventually become a commodity or mainstream. And I think for venture investors, let's just start with our perspective. You know, you have a time horizon under which you're looking to return capital to your LPs, right? And that typically limits how deep you can go back, right? So typically we don't, at least at Lakestar, for example, we don't invest in fundamental like research projects, right? And we don't even invest in really early product development, right? So we typically intercept kind of, you know, a little bit later where we see a path to a return within, let's say, 10 years. I think to your point, Pierre, there are sources of capital that are more designed for some of this really early laboratory scientific research. And that could be a government grant, that could be work at a university, that could be done in a lab of a larger corporate, you know, prior to breaking out or spinning out. And so we typically kind of intercept there. And then I think within Europe, there are very good, and as evidenced on this call, early stage deep tech investors that are kind of deep enough in the technologies that they're investing in that they can look for what I like to call leading indicators of success, right? Where they can intercept the technology in the research, in the product development phase, and really understand like, what is this technology? How does it work? Why will it work? And then what will be possible when it does work? And we think that actually within Europe, that's becoming quite a rich ecosystem, and it's true for various different domains. You have people who do this for, you know, quantum computing. You have people who do this for space. You have people who do this for batteries. Like we're starting to see that sprout. And in Europe, there's kind of what I would consider more traditionalist venture capital funds that maybe historically have done more enterprise SaaS. And they're not able to really read these leading indicators, right? These product metrics. They're more looking for ARR, right? A lagging indicator, right? Is there product market fit? Is there customer traction? And when there is, then they can underwrite kind of an early stage growth investment. I think Europe's lacking in two areas, right? The first area are larger check sizes when there isn't a lagging indicator yet, meaning a larger check size before you have large amounts of recurring revenue, but where there are good leading indicators, where if you understand the technology deeply, you can identify that there is something meaningful happening here, right? It just hasn't kind of crossed that bridge to high revenue numbers yet. And then there's also a bit of a lack of capital that is European in origin for very late stage growth rounds, right? Very, very large growth rounds. Most of that capital comes from the US and Asia at the moment. So I'll leave that one out of this conversation, but I think the opportunity that we saw and the reason that we're kind of investing a lot more in participating within the deep tech sector and collaboratively with the other funds like Vsquared, for example, who we have a number of investments with to date, is to say, okay, how can we partner with early stage deep tech investors and with entrepreneurs that are creating deep tech companies and help them bridge from, hey, we've done the research and development already. We're in the middle of the application phase. We have really good leading indicators, product metrics that indicate that that this is looking quite good, but we haven't yet scaled up commercially yet, right? There's typically a gap there with deep tech investors. And when you do, instead of a smooth SaaS curve that I think a lot of software investors are used to, you get this big step function where you go from being a deep tech company to like critical infrastructure or and so we're looking at helping kind of bridge financing there by doing the work to understand the signals and the leading indicators. And then by the time there are lagging indicators, there'll be a lot more folks who are comfortable joining in on the investment because they can just look at revenue as a proxy for whether or not something's working.
Great, thank you. Tommy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, just in general, the venture capital as an asset class is still, in Europe, considered to be a young asset class. It's not very mature. That doesn't mean that it's good in terms of performance, but if you compare it to the US, for example, we're just lacking a couple of decades in terms of knowledge, experience, and especially in experience and knowledge in terms also of examples on how it can play out if you go for that venture endeavor with your company. So this is one thing. And traditionally, it started off with software. But if you look in the heritage of venture capital globally, it was not always focused on software. It was just on, I'm not bankable. I can't get a loan by a bank. So I'm getting in private money and I value the risk by giving away equity of my company. So it's not that financed. So if you take that under consideration, we never asked ourselves, are we doing hardware or software? We've just been saying we want to enable technologies where there's no scientific risk involved anymore, but it's more like an engineering challenge and a path to how you can actually build a great and a big company out of it. And to match the time frame that we are all under, so it's these 10 plus 1 years until we have to return the funds to our LPs, you can pretty good identify these inflection points where technologies have an impact to markets, and they can either create new industries and new markets or service existing ones. I don't like the word disrupt because it's not too much on destroying something that is existing, but just taking it further through technology. So all these funding gaps and funding lags, it's right now what's missing, and Stephen is right with all the matching out where we have these gaps potentially. It's just right now there is not really a infrastructure in terms of funds, as you have growth funds in Europe who are investing in software, tech-enabled services whatsoever. Right now, there's not really a fund that has the mandate and the knowledge to assess later stage deep tech opportunities. And let's take space, for example. Either Aerospace haven't launched yet. They will launch by the end of the year. The rounds are getting quite high and the capital they need is getting quite high. You could say there's still too much risk involved, what we don't see, but a normal growth fund couldn't invest just purely through their mandate into a company like that. And if we want to solve that and have bigger check writers and don't rely on grants and governments and all that stuff, there needs to be an infrastructure where you say, hey, we're a team, we have the knowledge to assess it, we understand the risk, and we feel comfortable with investing 50 to 100 million plus tickets into technologies that will, that if they play out, going to have a tremendous return for our investors and solve a problem. So, and you know, that's kind of the only thing that I would say is still needed. And otherwise, Europe is pretty well set to leverage on that deep tech opportunity.
Understood. Thank you, Dan. In your experience in your portfolio, you know, as your companies scale up, have you seen any struggles, hurdles to making that bit of capital formation happen at that point?
Yeah, I think so. What I feel is the most difficult thing. There are a couple of things I might add. Rollout. I mean, the funding gap we've been talking about here. Okay, let me jokingly put this in context. So becoming an Excel sheet millionaire is much easier than deploying thousands and thousands of systems globally. So when we talk about hardware deployment, both Stephen and Thomas have mentioned this. There's a step function. There's additional capital needed, but it's not only a question of capital. I think one of the things that is really a challenge in Europe, as I think Stephen said, the technical abilities are there. The operational abilities are separated from these technical abilities sometimes. So it's in our portfolio we see companies building up factories, scaling up their solutions, and I think one of the thing that very few people talk about is that the sales markets aren't the innovation markets. So we have great innovation in Europe, but we mainly have, if I may say so, innovation theater when it comes to deployment of systems. And that is very dangerous. So if there are any ventures listening in, one of the things that one should not be held up by is all of these single test orders by large corporates in Europe that don't translate into hundreds or thousands of orders. So that's a dangerous thing in innovation, I think, particularly in Europe, where companies have to be careful that they make sure they have the sales pipeline internationally to grow. That's one thing that we are particularly focused on with Cycle, to help them grow internationally, because we feel that just following the innovation theater in Europe is a dangerous route, where there's a reason why the funding gap is there, a rational reason, which is that companies do not scale their turnover, especially in hardware tech, especially when it comes to infrastructure, fast enough in Europe. That is a difference we see in Asia. There's a huge difference in the US, especially with the new funding for clean tech. And if I may revisit the statement from the colleagues before, when you look at the first clean tech boom in Europe, or the first clean tech phase, as it was coined, the problem was more a geopolitical one and more the breakdown of the 2008, or there was a 2008 crisis. The leverage turned against the projects, and all the orders came down. Spain revoked its subsidies for solar. So there were a lot of things that happened. The subsidies dying off in Europe. The interest rates turned against the projects, and then the Chinese markets started their subsidy. So that was a double-sided sword for the clean tech space. I think in Europe, sometimes we don't think global enough early enough, which is different in space, of course. In space, you have to. But for deployment of clean tech, we also have to think global from the beginning. That's at least our conviction.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point you make. I would argue that ultimately is solar PV cell and module manufacturing a business you want to be in long term. It's pretty commoditized, pretty low margin. That being said, it's becoming a strategic sector. The German PV sector has been completely ravaged by Chinese subsidies. I mean, the Chinese out-subsidized themselves and drove like half of their industry into the ground as well. But that's for a different time. I think that sets it up nicely for the next part of our conversation, which is really around, two things. How do you identify the companies you want to back, and what characteristics do you like them to show for you to get the comfort that they could be a good financial investment? And what sectors, subsectors, and even you can take specific company examples that you've invested in or you're interested in, are you particularly excited about right now? And then we'll do this for the next 10 minutes, and then we can open it up to questions from the audience.
I mean, if okay, I'm just starting it off. So we do have our 5, as we call it, generational growth themes, because we don't think they will go away in the next 10 to 15 years in terms of importance. So what all companies have in common is they're based on a scientific or engineering innovation somehow. And why is it? Not for the sake of it, but it's actually, there must be a differentiation and a barrier of entry from other companies. So, we want to have that capital that we deploy used for building out the service on the product, and we have a time frame for it till it hits market. We don't necessarily want that capital to be used to keep competition of distance or buying market share, doing land grabbing, as you have it with some other games within the venture field. So, if it's kind of 5 to 8 teams globally who can pull it off in terms of technology, and that's an important thing, scale and build a company and understand on what's necessary aside the tech to build a great company, that's bringing it down to a few. And I guess we found good ways how to interact with the founding teams early on and understand, are they techy enough, if you want so? Are they entrepreneurs enough? Do they have an understanding that the best technology is not going to sell itself, but they have to sell it? They have to build a great company to attract talent. And if that all comes together within the defined fields of search that we're looking into, which normally comes along with how big is the market potential and the growth rates, this is what all companies have in common, I'd say. And now you can make difference in saying, are scientists and engineers always the best entrepreneurs very, very early on? And do they understand the metrics? That's not always the case, but we have the flexibility to coach them and talk to them very early on before we invest. And I would argue that teaching a rocket scientist a business metrics is a lot easier than explaining a business guy how rocket science and rocket engineering works. So, we're super confident that's all stuff that can be taught. The only thing that can be taught is the motivation, why you want to build that company. And obviously, one of the easy metrics in venture capital is how big can the company become and how big is your exit. But on that way, working through all the pain that you may have to experience and all the near-death experience you may have to experience as an entrepreneur, if money is the only motivation, that normally doesn't play out to become a really, really big company. So there's a component within it, and that's a more identified by gut feeling, I'd say, or experience. What has an entrepreneur bring along to build one of these outliers? And that's what we are looking for, aside, obviously, the tech differentiation.
Thank you, Tommy. Stephen?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think, obviously we're looking for deep tech companies on my team. So, we screen out, is there fundamentally new science or engineering, right? Is it deep tech? So that's the first thing. The second thing we look for, and again, some of this is repeat from what you said, Tommy, but I'll just say it in the words that we use, is actually pretty similar to what I think any good venture investor would look for, which is founder characteristics, right? So that would be, are they a good communicator? Are they a good leader? Are they inspiring, right? Can they motivate people? Can they attract talent and investment and partnerships? Do they have grit, right? Founding a company is incredibly hard. Are they going to persevere? Why are they going to persevere? Are they intrinsically motivated? Are they charming, right? Can they turn it on when they choose to? Like, there's these specific characteristics that we believe time and time again tend to lead to great leaders. And of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but we look for these types of character traits to indicate whether or not we think a founding team has what it takes to succeed as people, because a lot of this is partnering with and investing in people. And then I think we obviously on the deep tech side look for founder technology fit. And this is, do they have the technical acumen in order to really understand what it is they're dealing with and building? Or are they, two business-minded co-founders trying to build a quantum company? Like, that likely wouldn't be a fit for us. And then two, founder market fit. Do they understand the market that they're going to sell into? And that speaks to the business acumen, right? Are they going to be able to kind of really empathize with the customers and the needs and the problems and the markets that they want to sell into, which can be totally orthogonal to the technology itself. So that kind of captures the founder chunk of stuff. And then we kind of, if they pass that gate, start to look more at technology market fit. Okay, if we think the founder understands both the technology and the market, and we think the technology is novel and is going to work, then does this technology really solve problems in the markets that they want to sell it into? Have they identified, if they're very early companies, it might just be hypotheses. Hey, we have Earth observation satellites. We can use it for 4 different things, right? We're still going to validate which of these hypotheses is true and big, but we have to believe that there's a credible hypothesis that's worth investing capital to test. At the end of the day, I view venture investing as facilitating the scientific method, right? The founder has to come with a hypothesis. We're providing some funding and support resources for them to run an experiment, to then validate or invalidate the hypothesis and generate a new set of hypotheses. And ideally, they keep getting yeses, and then they can kind of work their way up the value curve. So we kind of structure our things that way. And then I think the back half of what we look for is pretty similar to any venture investor around legal diligence, financial diligence, business plan. Like, all these things are, standard, I would say. But a few of the things for deep tech are slightly different and require. That's why I believe that to do deep tech well before the company is a very obvious success case, you really have to be kind of deep in the what I call leading metrics, product metrics. If you'll permit me, I'll give one very easy to digest example of that, because sometimes people have a hard time visualizing product metrics if you're not familiar with them. Like, a lot of people don't really think of Google or Apple as deep tech companies, but they were in the beginning, right? They were doing fundamentally new things. And if you think about a company, let's even take Facebook for a moment. A lagging metric would be looking at Facebook or Google's revenue, right, to determine whether or not they're doing well and there's demand for them in the market. It's very obvious. It's the most, lowest risk measure of success. A leading metric for Facebook or Google in the early days would have been number of customers acquired in a given period of time, and then the engagement of those customers. So like DAO, MAU, WOW came about as these leading product metrics. Everyone knows them now and they seem obvious, but in the beginning, when Chamath, for example, was at Facebook, like, nobody had ever used these terms before. People didn't know how to value whether or not Facebook would end up generating a lot of revenue before they saw the revenue. And by determining how much kind of lifetime value you could glean from any given customer for any given amount of engagement, you can start to look at upstream leading metrics to determine how successful the company is going to be. And it's very non-obvious in the beginning, right? So I think for any of these new technologies that we're encountering, we're trying to think critically, and we don't always know the answer, but we try to figure out what are the leading metrics that are going to be good deterministic product metrics for things that inevitably end up generating revenue. And to do that, I think you have to be fairly deep on the technology.
That's very clear. Thank you, Stephen. Dan, anything to add?
Yeah, I think our selection criteria is a bit simply put. I'm looking for companies I would like to work for founders I would like to work for, because we end up working for them for free for a couple of years. So we're looking for people, purpose and profit. I think when we look at the potential to select them, the breakthroughs that we want to finance, we're looking at things because obviously this energy revolution that we are trying to trigger globally, the sustainability move, will have to have very large scale deployments of systems. And the energy efficiency, so scientifically, we already know in which trajectories these are potentially to be found. Some of them are still lingering around technology level 2 and 3. A lot of big corporations are competing with us on these deals. So the big Bosch, Mitsubishi, Siemens, ABB, these are our competitors in deep tech because they know their stuff. They know how to deploy things. They have access to capital. They have funding. So I think the challenge for all of us playing in this field, working in this field, is to outcompete them, finding the good deals earlier, helping the teams, as the other said, helping them proactively to be faster. I think the big challenge for European deep tech in that regard is that people, that the founders in Europe, they stealth for a very long time. So sometimes these companies or these founders work for many years on the technology before they are visible. Yeah? So it's hard to identify and find them, help them along the way, as a colleague said. But the other part of it, which is difficult, is this sudden go-to-market that we have to see in venture, because the time frame is very short, a decade or less. We have to build these international bridges, and I think more and more of the work in deep tech, in contrast to the geopolitical developments, will have to be in bridge building, in helping the founders go out there, get other markets, because one market alone is not enough for these technologies. They're very capital intense most of the time, in energy technologies and semiconductors, and also the competition is global. If you don't reach these other markets, if you don't get partnerships and deployment channels in place, you'll be outperformed by maybe a slightly less good technology because they have market access. So yeah, working with them, working for them for free for a time, taking the plane and getting them somewhere in Singapore, Hong Kong, China, India, Malaysia, Indonesia. That's our role with Cycle.
Thank you, Dan. I think that caps the section here, and we're going to open the floor to the attendees for a short Q&A session. So we'll be taking questions from the audience.
I guess I have a question. Stephen, you mentioned, founder characteristics, right, for deep tech startups. Just to be clear, I to my knowledge, I haven't invested in deep tech startups. So my founder characteristics are born out of the type of business models that I find, right? And I try to come up with what are the types of founder characteristics that I want. So I've come up with edge control, right? Take the right amount of mix in a time pressure and information pressure, not too much risk, not enough. I've come up with resilience and endurance. and a couple of others. But these are foundational, but they're also informed by the type of businesses that I look at. So are the founder characteristics for deep tech startups, even though we may be using the same words, right? And the same concepts are somewhat tweaked because the way you're going to grow your business is fundamentally different than in fintech or e-commerce and so on and so forth. That's my question.
Yeah. So two parts to the answer for me. One is like a personality character trait we treat a little bit differently than just strengths we're looking for from the founders, and the strengths we're looking for are deep tech specific, right? So for example, I mentioned founder technology fit, founder market fit, right? Those are a function of what is the technology that you're dealing with and do you understand it, right? That's a learned skill over time. That's not necessarily like a personality trait. Same with founder market fit, right? Do you understand the necessary business model and go-to-market motion that's going to be necessary for your business? Like that's mostly an exposure, a nurture thing, not a nature thing. So those we do look for, and I agree with you, and those are very much indexed to the technologies and the markets that founders are going to be operating in. The personality characteristics, I would argue, overlap a lot with any kind of sector that you're investing in, right? For example, you mentioned endurance, right? We call that grit, same thing, right? It's like founding any company is hard. So you have to have the ability to cope with that. Although I think the sensitivity of certain characteristics within deep tech are slightly different than maybe an enterprise SaaS company. And like a very obvious example might be communication skills, right? If you're making an HR tech company, like the vocabulary is much better known to the broad population. So you're able to discuss what you're doing, potentially even using some industry acronyms, and people kind of know what you mean. And so the success of your ability to communicate is hinged less on how well can you articulate sophisticated concepts to an unsophisticated audience. I think in deep tech, you are the founders, there's much more of a dependency on the founders to very clearly and simply articulate very complicated, sophisticated niche topics to a broad set of, employees or investors or partners or regulators or whatever. So the necessity of a founder to be able to articulate and communicate exceedingly well is very high. So our tolerance for a founder that may struggle a bit on the communication side is lower. And while that can be coached and taught a bit, we also recognize that like you're doing a bunch of other things. And so you don't have a lot of, free mental capacity or time to learn a bunch of things on the go. Like you kind of have to go into it with a set of skills to give yourself the highest likelihood stochastically of success. So I think that's an example on both sides, which hopefully answers your question to some degree.
Yeah, and I would add, thank you, Stephen, Pascal, I would add different types of some of the characteristics you mentioned as well. I think in less technology heavy or science heavy entrepreneurial ventures, progress tends to be relatively linear. Whereas, I think deep tech has this characteristic where progress really comes in kind of step functions. And so what you will be looking in founders is that resilience and this idea that the founder should be comfortable with nonlinear progress, lack of revenues, lack of substantial technical progress for months on end, potential, failures, particularly in, rocket companies, for example. You have to be comfortable that you're going to be most likely failing the first few launches before you are successful, and that progress and success is not whether your launch is successful, is how much flight can you accomplish and how much data can you get so that you can go back to the saddle and just improve the product and the rocket in this particular instance.
And maybe to add on something that Stephen mentioned, or give a little explanation on Facebook being a deep tech company early on. As you have, if you're dealing with investments that will need excessive amount of capital to get from A to B later on, you have to provide that content and context why somebody who is not from that space feel comfortable and just assess it as a good financial investment. And again, if it's semiconductor or space, just define your KPIs that measures success, and that measures that in a limited period of time with limited access to capital, you can create something where there's a comparison on the market. So back then at ISA Aerospace, for the seed round, it was getting within 12 months the turbopump built, manufactured, and actually tested on a test stand. And that being done with 2 million in capital within 12 months, in comparison on how long would SpaceX need for that? How long would Ariane Space need for that? So you can actually explain somebody that you're very good in what you do. And in addition to that, I mean, you can make a science out of assessing these deals or these teams. Steve and I attended a conference where one of the founders or the partners of Founders Fund spoke, and on that question answered just saying, if you have a founding team and you want to invest, you normally know within the first 5 minutes into the talk and into the conversation, where you're getting that feeling, can they pull it off, yes or no? And everything else is actually manifesting your gut feeling in terms of how big is the market, how, where they're in terms of tech, how much capital do they need? Is it a good investment, yes or no? These are kind of sanity checks. But if you have the feeling that somebody is able to pull it off and getting it all together through experience, I guess you get that feeling very early on, and you should trust that.
Yeah, great. Maybe I can add something on the non-linearity that you mentioned, Pierre. When we look at deep tech companies, so as an example, one of the founders I really admire in our portfolio is Turkish-German. He's been working for 13 years on a new epitaxy process. 13 years. And he's built systems, tested them relentlessly. And we're scaling up this technology now, which probably will be changing the whole semiconductor industry. And I think what is difficult around this is, as you said, it's a step function sometimes. But what you can assess when you go into deep tech topics like this, is what is the potential if it goes right? How right does it go? How big is the influence on the whole semiconductor market? To me, these web topics aren't deep tech because for me, the meaning of technology is the science of technique, and deep science of technique for me is something where we push the boundaries of what is status quo of the scientific understanding of technique. So that's why I mentioned the Schottky-Kaiser limit, the Carnot cycle boundaries, or what is a semiconductor. So at the moment, the body of knowledge of science is moving from the understanding of how a normal semiconductor works. We've expanded the definition of semiconductor to wide bandgap semiconductors, which weren't considered semiconductors before, and how they are made. The technique of manufacturing of semiconductors will change while this knowledge graph is updating in science. So I think when you find so I'm not sure I think my understanding is different of what a founder needs to communicate this correctly, because I think the audience is not as it is with web companies or with consumer companies. It's not the broad audience. The audience of our portfolio companies are General Foundries, TSMC. These are their customers. So the specific, I mean, how they pitch their product is very technical. It's highly technical. If you don't have a background in consuming these products, then you would not make sense of any of the abbreviations. So it's very difficult for an outsider to understand it if you don't have a basic understanding of the technology, I think. So I wouldn't underwrite that. The founders need to be great communicators. I think in deep tech is one of the rare exceptions where the founders can be scientifically, technologically great. Of course, they need to have someone who sells the product, and founding team should have a great CEO to form these corporations which are needed in this space. But it's not the broad. We're not selling to the internet in most of the cases. We're selling to industrial customers, and that also makes the journey a bit complicated because every country is different. Selling to Korea, selling to Japan, selling to China is different than selling to the US or selling in Europe. I think one thing we're looking for is founders who have the openness to go to the US and Japan, to India and China. I think that's the challenge that we see in Europe, that many people have closed mindsets in selling their systems, and I think that limits the potential of the addressable market.
Great, thank you, Dan. We have time for one more question from the audience. I thought there was a question waiting. Does it seem to be the case anymore?
There was one indeed, but it was answered in the meanwhile.
Great. I guess we are wrapping up then. Thank you everyone for attending. Hope that was helpful conversation that we had today. I'd like to thank all the participants for their very valuable insights into this corner of the tech industry and the venture industry that's certainly gaining in prominence with everything that's happening from a strategic and geopolitical standpoint. So thank you for your time today.
Yeah, and if you want to reach out and take this one-on-one, or you have any further questions, I just posted my email address to the thread. It's tommy@vsquared.vc. I'm always happy to help.
Thank you, Tommy.
Cool.
Thank you, Steven. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, the LPEA team, for setting this up.
Have a great week.
Yeah, great to be here. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.